Well, a very good morning, everyone. It's okay, they're not really worried about us making too much noise. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Doesn't that video just remind you what a great place this is? And I think that's sort of the tone we want to set as we start our final day of conference. It's a great pleasure to be with everyone once again. I hope everyone is feeling well rested. I had 9 hours sleep last night. And I told Bill and the team that I really wanted to do this because I believe in Standard Bank, but really it's because I wanted some sleep. All right. We sit at a moment that I think many of us would say is pivotal in South Africa. And this is the one moment we want to focus on this country. We have a government of national unity, and there are many who believe that this is going to be an opportunity perhaps to turbo boost reform and to help us build a more prosperous and inclusive South Africa. But one analyst described it as something that's been cobbled together as an unwieldy coalition of 11 parties, each pursuing its own positions, power, access to resources, and patronage for supporters. He even described the GNU as a hybrid animal, somewhere between a buffalo and an antelope, akin to a wildebeest, or what the Khoisan refer to as a gnu. No one needs reminding that for a long time, ours has been a country in deep crisis. The state has been collapsing around us, skilled people, both black and white, firms, capital, leaving, the tax base shrinking. And where we do rank highly in comparison to many parts of the world, it's often in areas like unemployment and the crime rate. But now we have a government that says it believes in constitutionalism, the rule of law, and an expanded role for the market in growing the economy and creating jobs. Dare we hope for another dawn? Our first session today is going to be a deep dive into South Africa post-elections. Gulam Balim, the chief economist at Standard Bank Group, is going to lead this discussion. Please welcome him to the stage.
Again, good morning. Fine manners would dictate that I say thank you, Bongani, but with that daunting introduction, I'm not so sure you've given me an easy start. My 11-year-old, when I make what I think is a hilarious dad joke, and he thinks it's not funny, will tearfully look at me and say, romp, romp. Romp, romp. But then I also know never mess with the man who has the microphone last. So my apologies. I'd like to, again, present my views on South Africa, and I brought along a little bit of theatre, like yesterday. And like yesterday, I've parceled into 3 parts. I want to revisit the last 3 decades, but it'll be a really crisp rendition of the last 3 decades. I think it bears monumentally in the manner in which we think about our status quo. The second part is, again, briefly, just to revisit the election result. It certainly was deafening in terms of its outcome. And then the last part is to suggest our prognosis. And I'm going to attempt to convince you that I think the path to prosperity is not just plausible, but I think since the recent election has shifted to probable. So, starting with the last 3 decades or so, you will notice I have a fondness for arcs, but it's hard not to suggest that this boomerang keeps revisiting when you look at South Africa's GDP growth over the last 30 years or so. You can see it's almost a crisp 2 halves. In other words, the first 15 years or so, we enjoyed handsome ascendancy. We then crest, and then in the latter half of the last 30 years, there is almost uninterrupted trend slide. Now, I've plastered the presidential administrations over that data, not to give any particular president special cheer, or to subtly suggest there's a polemic heading the way of one president, but it's clear in terms of presidential administrations a type of policy compass that may have had a role in guiding GDP. To describe the last 30 years in just 4 words, 4 chapters I think framed the last 30 years. Reconciliation, institutions, impunity, and reform. What I mean by that is Madiba gave us reconciliation. I think it was priceless. Quite simply, the ability for black people and white people to conceive that they could have a shared prosperity, to avoid civil war, quite frankly, and to be able to form a common path. I said it was priceless, and I think we'll never be able to put a value on that period. I labeled the presidential term of former President Thabo Mbeki as one of institutions. I'm not suggesting that institutional functioning was perfect. In fact, it was imperfect. But for the most part, not just the political center, but the institutional center held. The broad course of rule of law held favorably, and in fact, the rule of law generally showed trend improvement in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Under the era that I've labeled impunity, I think it's common cause our institutional foundations were butchered. In economics school, likely in your very first semester, they will guide you to believe that the formula for economic growth is rooted in 4 items. And I've alluded to it yesterday. Financial capital, human capital, and physical capital, blended with a good deal of innovation. What we call, to elevate our job spec, multi-factor productivity. Those are the 4 root causes of economic growth. More latterly, we've come to better understand that they're the proximate causes of economic growth. What matters most, and broadly speaking, is the rule of law. And specifically, what I'm talking about is aggregate governance. And to be a little bit numeric, which is quite bold, it's to suggest that 75% of the reason economies prosper is the rule of law. A mere 25% relates to the capital stock and innovation. If one were to review the history of 150 countries around the world over the recent decades, the correlation is unambiguous. There is no middle ground. There is no half pregnant. It is a rule of law, prosperity, no rule of law, no prosperity. It's unambiguous. It's unsurprising with that butchering of our institutions, with the fragmentation of the rule of law, with aggregate governance being crippled, that South Africa's GDP growth rate slid from a steady state 4% in the early 2000s to a tepid, struggling 1% now. Of course, it hasn't helped that we had the GFC 2008 and 9, which was also a bloody blow, and a more recent hammer blow in the form of COVID, as you can see from this exhibit. Under President Cyril Ramaphosa, he has attempted to instill a reform agenda. We've conceived of that reform agenda under 2 headings: institutional reform and macroeconomic reform. As you know, that meme says you only had 1 job, well, the president had 2. Institutional reform, we judge to be the repair of all of those institutions that hold the guardrails of South Africa, whether it is the police services, investigative bodies, the NPA, IPID, which is the policemen, the revenue authority, and so on. Repair of these institutions, which, as I said at the beginning, is the bulk of reason an economy would grow. The other area would be macroeconomic reforms. Reforms with regard to, for example, liberalizing the power sector, improving the capacity of Transnet. Other microeconomic reforms that make it easier to do business. Visa reforms that enhance businessmen flow and tourism to South Africa, for instance. So we captured the reform agenda, as I've suggested, under those broad two headings. I think with respect to institutional reform, we'd actually judge President Ramaphosa somewhat favorably, especially with regard to executive appointments, although much still needs to be done, because many of those institutions were hollowed out. With macroeconomic reform, up until about a year ago, we probably would have given the president a score of 2 out of 10 at best. However, since round about May of last year, we've seen a level of resolve that has been quite meaningful. Meaningful to the extent that it has meaningfully buoyed the prospects of our electricity supply. We're seeing early momentum in Transnet. We think we'll see some incremental gains on crime and so forth. So it does appear that South Africa is institutionally and macroeconomic reforms bottoming. And just to underscore the point of South Africa's slippage, not just in terms of absolute performance, but relative to, let's say, two peers. This exhibit shows you our per capita income and that of Brazil and India. As you can see, Brazil saw an astonishing leap during President Lula's era in terms of GDP per capita gains. Really impressive. It started in the aftermath of President Lula's first term, Dilma Rousseff, but has been able to ascend. When you look at Brazil's GDP per capita, just bear in mind that it houses more than 200 million people. That's impressive. South Africa crested, as you can see, around about 2011, and for the most part, we've been drifting. In fact, more recent data would suggest we're less than $6,000 per capita. India, of course, a large population, but I think to be cheered that there's been almost uninterrupted ascendancy in per capita gains. And to the extent that India's growth will probably for a while still surpass that of China, suggests that they are on a good wicket. The elections were stunning. Some would say that the ANC's demise arrived slightly sooner than it should have. Perhaps the 40% result should have been ordained in 5 years' time. But I suspect, apart from allegations of graft, corruption, executive excess, municipal failure, the full portfolio of assault on the ANC-led government, I believe that the electricity woes will probably be dominant in shaping public opinion and stymieing the ANC's prospects. It's been more than 10 years now that we suffered under the weight of electricity shortfalls. The energy availability factor, which is effectively the theoretical ability to generate power from available stock, has in fact been quite low for a length of time. There was a significant subsidence, what we would call a demand shock around COVID. Industry shut down, businesses were reclusive, and of course demand for electricity declined. But subsequently, with the switch on, there was still an inability of Eskom to be able to deliver, and that is the supply shock. Supply shocks are different from demand shocks. Demand shocks can very often be repaired by improving confidence. You lower rates, you generate some fiscal response, a little bit of leadership mantra, and you can precipitate a recovery premised on that earlier fall off in demand. Supply shocks are different. Supply shocks typically require investment. They require multi-year repair. And of course, that repair has been to the benefit of, for example, the renewables industry and entrepreneurs in that space. I guess the good news is both that Eskom seems to have reached a low point and things are likely to improve over the near to medium term. Also, the augmented supply of energy, whether it is rooftop solar or more industrial scale energy generation, continues to grow and will supplement energy from Eskom. In fact, Eskom's total supply of energy to the economy has fallen from near 100% to around 92%. And of course, the renewable energy thrust continues. So it was merely to underscore, I suspect, that the electricity hammer blow was very meaningful in sapping the ANC's legitimacy, but at the same time perhaps nudging us to a reform process that will prove enduring and also informing the idea that we are on the cusp of a more prosperous outcome. So what of the results? And again, as I said, I won't dwell at great length. The exhibit on the top and on the extreme left gives you the results. The ANC, when you blend the national and the regional result, the provincial result achieved slightly under 40%. The Democratic Alliance at around 22%. Umkhonto weSizwe surprised us. This was Jacob Zuma's party, or at least Jacob Zuma being the figurehead of this assembly that is quickly beginning to organize itself, experienced a heady and very successful 15%. Just to give you some sense, this was a party forged only months before the election and was able to record twice what South Africa's economic freedom fighters, the EFF, scored in its first election contest, around 7%, and even though it had more than 2 years to prepare. So the Umkhonto weSizwe arrival on the scene was quite significant, even if it represented a carve-out of the ANC, and some would say ethnic foundations. The EFF, as you can see, 9.6%, and so on. Now, the lower exhibit is just the change in election result from the previous 5 years, from 2019. And just to underscore how MK, freshly minted, saw its arrival burnished onto the political scene. The Patriotic Alliance gained 2 percentage points, Action SA 1.29. The DA swelled by a little bit more than 1%, and the IFP also grew. On the extreme left of the lower chart, you can see the ANC's 18 percentage point plunge. The EFF, as I said, slipped. But just to give perspective, 20 years ago, 2014, forgive me, that's 10 years ago, the ANC mustered 69.7%. Let me correct that, 2004. The ANC mustered 69.8%, almost 70%. For the ANC to have delivered 40% represents an almost halving of its performance only 20 years ago, signaling, as I said, the loss of legitimacy. And just to tear a little deeper into the election results and what it means and possibly what it foretells, the circled areas give you some sense of where the African National Congress still commands a majority: the Eastern Cape, the Free State, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and the Northwest. The ANC has still been able to harness a majority in these provinces. In Gauteng, the ANC saw meaningful fall-off. The same with KwaZulu-Natal. Only marginal slippage below 50% in the Northern Cape, where the ANC was easily able to assemble a coalition. And of course, for a length of time, the ANC has not had a firm grip on the Western Cape. But what I want to do with this is make the following point. Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, when combined with the Western Cape, comprises 62% of GDP. and houses 55% of South Africa's population. In other words, the ANC has lost majority grip in almost 2/3 of the economy and certainly more than half of its citizens. And I think that is a reflection that certainly has dawned on the ANC and the tilt to the government of national unity out of sheer necessity. Just to give, again, a slightly further graphical image of the election result. So those two arcs give you the distribution of seats in Parliament on the middle exhibit, the left-hand side arc 2019 and 2024. And it just gives you a graphic display of the ANC shrinkage in terms of seats. As I said, the DA gained a little bit. The yellow is Umkhonto we Sizwe and the red is the EFF. I think it gives you a sense, and I'm probably being quite subtle when I'm saying that Parliament is going to be noisy. I suspect Parliament is going to be a battleground, of course, in terms of theatrics, a battleground in terms of legislation, a battleground in terms of lawfare within its structures. It is going to be incredibly contesting. But I think what we can also say is that the liberation ideology still remains a feature of South African society, to the extent that if you were to amass the ANC, Umkhonto we Sizwe, and economic freedom fighters' numeracy, it still amounts to in excess of 2/3 of the overall vote count. The ANC for a length of time was judged a broad church, and legitimately so. It was able to house a multiple of classes, race groups, and effectively a mass of society was able to assemble and find common ground under that broad church. And I tend to look at the government of national unity as the broad church reincarnated. I give certainly credence to Bongani's suggestion of a really clumsy assembly with the capacity for unified thought quite difficult, and the capacity for strained processes and policy making to come to the fore. However, I also find encouragement from the notion that with the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, two parties, 40% plus 22%, let's say that assembles at around 62%. South Africans have installed these two parties at slightly under 2/3. And I think the most common ideal, especially the ANC of President Ramaphosa and the DA, is an attempt at the reform process, at an attempt at improving the governance landscape. And I think while there's certainly going to be dissent on many other areas, I think the idea of reform sits at the heart of those two anchor parties, dare I say. And I think that therefore gives, within the confines of the theoretical suggestion I made earlier that the rule of law is everything, that directionally and in terms of the first principles, I think South Africa is directionally constructive. Let me come to the near end of my formal remarks with just a few elements, and I think just one or two more slides of encouragement. Cyclically, inflation, like in many parts of the world, is decelerating, disinflating. It means that we are on the cusp of, not just in South Africa, but globally, an easing monetary cycle. That is going to be a tonic for confidence. And, of course, it is going to precipitate lower interest rates. So I think we're on the cusp of at least a cumulative 1 percentage point of interest rate relief in South Africa over the next, say, 3 to 4 quarters, which, of course, as one would imagine, is relief to consumers and some level of stimulus for investment. So, after tightening monetary policy, at least there is this tool of thrust on its way. Lower inflation boosts real incomes, aside from, of course, the interest rate relief. And that real income turning point, which I think is in the making, will provide additional consumer buoyancy. It's not going to generate a lively consumer cycle, but positive real wages has always proven to be a source of consumer thrust, generally speaking. But perhaps this is the anchor slide in terms of promise. And it's the anchor slide that I think also attempts to engage with Bongani's challenge of unwieldy politics. The good news is that the recovery is already baked in, notwithstanding the politics. What do I mean by that? In 2022, the electricity woes subtracted 2 percentage points from our GDP potential. Last year, it was probably around 1.2 percentage point. In other words, if we have, broadly speaking, uninterrupted power supply for the foreseeable future, it simply reinstates that foregone GDP shock. And so I estimate just Eskom's repair could generate at the minimum 1.3 percentage points of growth thrust into the economy. And as I've suggested, it is largely baked in, only compromised by Eskom relapse, which I think is likely, which is improbable. Transnet, as I've said, early reform momentums. It remains messy, but I suspect if we get the logistics infrastructure incrementally improving, and as I've suggested, network industries matter, and incremental progress compounds, again, I think there could be between 0.5 and 0.7 of a percentage point of growth lift emerging over the next 2 to 3 years. And there's the other reforms. Visa reforms. We've already seen Home Affairs and the new minister act with zeal in terms of attempting to accelerate businessmen's reforms, or at least business applications for reforms, and other costless reform measures are just making microeconomic reforms and the cost of doing business easier. 3.5% GDP growth, reoccurring, would be incredibly meaningful in buoying South Africa's prospects. Many people are either unaware or forget. South Africa enjoyed a golden era. And through all this sort of last 25 minutes of narrative or so, if I were to leave you with just one message, growth solves a lot of problems, if not all problems. Between 2002 and 2006, the South African economy grew by, on average, 4.5% per year. Over that roughly handful of years, we generated 2 million formal sector jobs. Each formal sector job in the local economy, aside from, of course, the direct benefit of the person employed enjoying an income, there is the indirect benefit where the formally employed person, through that person's income, is able to buoy the welfare of another 3.4 people. In other words, it's an average for South Africa. 3 to 4 near dependents' welfare is boosted by proximity to that one person who's got a formal sector job. Between 2002 and 2007, 10 million South Africans saw their welfare employed because of the direct and indirect benefits of a formal sector job. And that's the minimum, because I'm not even talking about the induced. Direct, indirect, induced. By induced, what we mean is I get a job, I get some income and support my family, and we go to the local shop, the local spaza shop, or the local convenience store, and we shop, and we boost the prospects of someone being employed. That's induced. I've excluded the induced impact. And that was a golden era, and I would be so bold as to suggest so many of South Africa's black, middle, and high income class, present today, found their roots in that golden era, found their traction in the economy in that golden era. So over the near to medium term, what we think is possible, for every 1% increase in GDP growth in South Africa, employment increases by 0.7%. and that is double the global average. At a steady state 3% growth, we think we could generate 350,000 formal sector jobs in a year. 350,000 additional jobs would benefit those near dependents in the order of 1.2 million people. Over a 5-year period, we suspect 8 million people could see their lives touched in a positive way from growth. And this excludes the additional welfare benefits that will come from, for example, the boost in confidence, fiscal spending, and the delivery through the social wage system, for example. So growth is a powerful tonic. It solves a lot of problems. And probably more than ever, the prospects for South Africa appear to be tilted upwards. And people in this room, dare I say, are the constructive weapons for this type of ambition. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Bongani, over to you.
Thank you, Gulam. Perhaps a joke or two of my own in terms of dad jokes. Why did the Scarecrow win the award? He was outstanding in his field. I'm reading a book at the moment. Thank you. I'm reading a book at the moment on anti-gravity. It's really hard to put down. I could go on and on and on and on. So as we get ready for our next session, please don't mind what happens behind me, because of course they're going to be putting together the chairs for the panel discussion that will follow. So whilst they do that, perhaps, Gulam, I must also point out that what we've done on my show, on my radio program, over the last sort of 10 days or so, is to start conversations with a number of the incoming ministers, particularly those who are members of cabinet for the first time. And I don't know what your impression is, and this is across the board. We've been deliberate about inviting non-ANC as well as ANC ministers onto the program. And maybe it's early days yet, but my sense is that there's almost a clamor amongst them to get off the ground, to hit the ground running. If I can mix my metaphors there, but this idea that there's almost a competition, if not to do something, certainly to be seen to be doing something. And hopefully that's the kind of thing that gives buoyancy, as you say, to what comes next, to growth and other opportunities. So thank you very much for setting the scene for what happens next in South Africa. Right, as we move on then to our program, it's a fireside chat with our African giants. I'm going to invite my colleague Nzinga Qunda to come to the stage and introduce her panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bongani. A very good morning to you. As he said, my name is Nzinga Qunda. It's such a privilege to be here moderating this next session. Africa continues to emerge as a global economic powerhouse, and over the last few days, this conference and the events around it have served as a place for really fostering cross-regional dialogue and collaboration and a swapping of ideas. In our fireside chat with titans in the industry shortly, we're going to be looking at capitalizing on the opportunities that Africa's people and resources offer, exploring avenues for investment, trade, and developing strategic partnerships, and we'll examine how leveraging collective expertise and a shared vision can create sustainable growth and innovation, as well as opportunities and challenges faced by companies and institutions operating across the continent. Joining us to do this, our panelists, if I can ask them to please make their way to the stage, Sim Chabalala, the Chief Executive Officer of the Standard Bank Group, Phuthi Mahanyele-Dabengwa, the Chief Executive Officer of NASPAR South Africa, and Patrick Mwehire, the Regional Chief Executive, East Africa Standard Bank Group. A round of applause, please, for them as they make their way to the stage as well. And Adrian Basson, the Chief Executive Officer at Hungry Lion. A very good morning. Sim, thanks so much for having us.
Good morning, thank you very much.
And this incredible conference that's taking place. Perhaps I'll start with you. As the Chief Executive Officer of Standard Bank Group, you've been instrumental in Standard Bank's significant expansion on the continent and beyond. Can you share the key strategies that you've implemented to achieve a market position which sees the bank having a strong presence and deep capabilities across at least 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you very much, Nzinga. So first of all, congratulations to you, my learned friend.
Almost learned friend.
One of the clients, a very important client of the bank, remarked that he thought that our board had lost its mind in having a chief executive who's a lawyer. So I think I reminded him, he's a dear friend of mine, I reminded him that I've got a lot of friends who are lawyers. Koos Becker is also a lawyer, right? At Naspers. Bill Blackie is a lawyer. Adrian, sorry for you, an accountant. The first point then I'm making is that we have depended very, very heavily on know-how, a diverse team of people, and people who truly understand the African continent. Our group was formed in October 1862 in Port Elizabeth. And it was formed by wool traders who went off to the United Kingdom to raise funds and formed the company so that they could facilitate trade between Port Elizabeth, Southern Africa, and the United Kingdom. That deep history and set of expertise continues to define who Standard Bank is today, and it's an important part of our competitive advantage. So that's the first point. The people, a deep history, and then secondly, Nzinga, the financial sector is reliant on scale. So there's a famous aphorism which is that providence favors the big battalions. The Standard Bank is the largest financial institution on the continent by assets. We've got the largest capital base. The second largest is a competitor whose colors are turquoise, and we will not mention their name, but we are 23% larger than they are in terms of the capital base. Our capital base is 23% larger than that institution, which puts us in a position to be able to give our clients access to capital and the capital that they need to grow their businesses. So fortune favors the big battalions, a safe institution, your money is safe with us. The next consideration is our brand, which clearly you respect because you're wearing blue, unlike another person who was wearing red yesterday. Our brand. We have been in existence, as I said to you, from October 1862, and the name at the time of this great institution was the Standard Bank of British South Africa Limited. It's still the Standard Bank, except that it's no longer of the British South Africa. It's now the Standard Bank of South Africa. So the same name, the same brand, this shield representing a shield and a flag in that shield has been in existence again since 1862. It represents pioneering, innovation, and growth on our continent. The next consideration is that we have consistently provided a great set of services and innovations to our clients. And let me mention two, if you don't mind. The first one is in November last year, we assisted the National Treasury of South Africa to raise 20 billion rand with a sukuk. It was unique. It was oversubscribed. It was 1.7 times oversubscribed. And it raised money from the Middle East, the Gulf states, and it was a sukuk. The second one, which Patrick can remember, we were in in Marrakesh at the IMF meetings late last year. And Gulam and his team, together with our Kenyan colleagues, convened a forum. Present at that forum were investors, and that set of investors was listening to the Minister of Finance and the Central Bank of Kenya. At the time, the Kenyan 2024 bond was trading at roughly, I think, 19%. That morning, convened by Gulam and the team, the ministry and the central bank described their monetary policy and fiscal policy. That bond rallied by 5%, if I remember correctly. We've since helped the Kenyan government raise the liquidity necessary for it to settle that bond in July this year. The point of that is we've contributed to financial deepening, and we've assisted in the development of the financial sector. And lastly, and then I will keep quiet. I'm Nguni, by the way, and you know the Ngunis can talk, right? We'll talk all morning. But let me make the last point. We've grown at Standard Bank in all the classic ways. Firstly, organically, following our clients, helping them solve problems. Many clients here, Hungry Lion, Naspers, we've been helping them grow throughout the continent, and we partner each of them in all the countries where they're operative on our beloved continent. And that is something we've done since Pa fell off the bus. Secondly, we have made acquisitions. In Nigeria, we run the leading corporate and investment bank. It was a combination of our own bank, which we had bought when we bought ANZ Grindlays in 1994, and we merged that bank with IBTC, the premier investment bank at the time, built by Atero Pirasai together with Yinka Sani, who was here yesterday. And the colleagues from Nigeria will remember the fact that that is still the premier investment bank in Nigeria. So organic growth and also growth by acquisition, following our clients and contributing to financial deepening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Puti, as Sim is speaking about growth and expansion, one can't help but think about Naspers, which has grown into a global tech giant from its roots in South Africa. I know that your strategy has been to invest, scale, and crystallize. What other growth tips do you have for companies with global aspirations or growth ones?
Thank you very much, Nzinga, and thank you very much, Sim, for having us all here. It really is wonderful to be here with everyone. So I think a big area for us that has been of importance is firstly visionary leadership. And we've had the great leadership from Koos Bekker, whom you mentioned, who really...
A lawyer.
Pardon?
A lawyer.
Who has really led the business from being a media-focused, print media, television, towards being a business that became the business that we are today, where we are focused on significant businesses across the world. Essentially, we're now in markets across the world, focused on internet businesses. And what we have found with that is just the significant support that you find in markets as you go into them. So that visionary leadership has been important. We are seeing it today with Fabrizio, our new CEO, Fabrizio Bloisi, who was actually one of the founders in one of our businesses. So across the world, whether we are in Brazil, which is where he comes from, or India, or wherever we are, we come in through partnering with founders of those businesses. And so Fabrizio, you know, we started with him. He was running a business called Movile, which, you know, was doing fairly well. And then together with us, he invested into a business called iFood. He started as an early stage business, which is what we do. We focus on those early stage businesses. And today, that business has just scaled significantly. It is now delivering around 850 million orders per annum. And it is not only in Brazil, but is actually just, you know, within the whole of Southern America. And so, you know, having that significant business in Latin America growing and having leadership from that type of business is something that has been very helpful. So visionary leadership. The second thing has been our focus on emerging markets. So when we started going into emerging markets, it was back in early 2000s, and that was under the leadership of Koos. It was at a time when it was, these were not markets that were easy to do business in. And I think one of the great things about being entrepreneurs and business people on this continent is that we know how to do business in difficult environments. And so when we went into environments such as Brazil, India, China, and of course, the other R country, which is probably best left unmentioned, we went into these countries seeking, once again, to partner with these founders of businesses and to scale up with those businesses, and have been able to achieve tremendous growth through those businesses. And then I would say the third has been also a focus on AI. That has really been the driver of growth in our businesses. And so within our businesses today, we use something we call Token. And you can go on to token.ai and you'll find a lot of information on that. Essentially, this is an AI support system which provides support to all of our businesses, ensuring that delivery processes are done as systematically as possible, really looking at all of the issues that can ensure that we have much more successful businesses across the world that we operate in. And we serve 2 billion consumers around the world. And so having the support of AI is something that has been significantly important. The last thing that I would mention is really how we engage as a team. And we use an entity called Slack, where on Slack, you don't have to get a meeting with a particular executive or whomever you need to engage with. And so despite whatever role you play in the organization throughout the world, you can speak to anybody that works within the group on Slack. You can arrange meetings on Slack. We do a lot of work on Slack, and a lot of that is being driven by Fabricio, ensuring that we can all engage, irrespective of what role or what company, what part of the organization you're in, or what geography you're in. We all engage simultaneously on various issues. And so I would say that those are some of the key issues that have really led our growth, and I think is very helpful in any growing organization.
Adrian, you've pretty spoken about leadership and that visionary element of it as well. You were saying yesterday that you're very privileged to have watched your family business, and as you run yours, also implementing those tips and even passing them along in your chats about debt to your son. Just take us through what you would say are the 3 lessons that you've gleaned from that experience of watching a big brand like Shoprite grow and then growing something like Hungry Lion as well.
Yes, thank you. So I'm here as an aspiring giant Hungry Lion, but I was privileged to be part of an actual African giant, which is Shoprite. And I always tell people, and they ask me, how long have you been with Shoprite? And I said, 48 years. So I was paid for about 18, and I was on the board for about 6 of those 18. So I had a first row seat, and sometimes active participation in the growth of the business within Africa. So one of the big lessons that I learned, and as a son of an accountant, and as an accountant, I don't have all the strategic leadership like the lawyers, but I understand numbers. and what I learned is that, and I'm going to steal a quote from Dr. Hans Rosling, who was the only interesting statistician, I think from Sweden, where he looked at the world population and said, let's say he's now passed on, but he's, a few years back, let's say 8 billion people, 1 billion in America, 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, and about 4 billion in Asia, so that's 8 billion. If we fast forward to 2100, it's going to be still 1 billion in the Americas, 1 billion in Europe, 4 billion in Africa, and about 5 billion in Asia, and that gets you to about 11 billion, so 10, 11 billion, depending on and how love goes in the future. So if I'm a consumer-driven business and I want to sell chicken, I want to sell it to 4 billion people. I don't want to sell it to 1 billion people. So where's the growth? It's in population, it's in numbers. Even if we say Africa's a poor continent, it's only $1 per person. Yes, but it will go to $2 per person. So there's 300% growth in population, there's 100% growth per person. So as a basic accountant, I can work out the numbers and say, that's a good business, or a good place to do business in. If I'm in Japan, and I've got the McDonald's business there, I think they've got about 120 million population, going down to 80 million. So if you've got 1,000 McDonald's stores, the 80 million people are going to eat less McDonald's burgers than 120 million people. So if you ask me what lessons did I learn, 2 things. One is trust the trend and say, this is the trend, this is where we're going. Africa is the place to be. Just not be here for the next 5 years, be here for the next 75 years. So let's aim for 2,100. 2,100 will be up there, but the road's got to go like this. So if you're not prepared to stick to something long-term, don't do it, and especially in Africa. So that's one thing. The second one is you must love what you do. If you don't love what you do, you're not going to do it for the right reasons. So I call myself an Afro-optimist. I love being in Africa. I want to stay here. I enjoy it much more going into Africa than into Europe or any other place in the world, in so much I semi-forced my wife and my 3 boys to go and live in Lusaka for the previous 2 June holidays. So for a month, I said, we're booking a house in Lusaka, and then we'll do weekend trips from there, so I could work during the week. So I'm trying to also instill that exposure and love for the continent in my own family. So 3 lessons: trust the trend, trust the numbers, and love what you do.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, you oversee Standard Bank's operations in East Africa, a business that last year saw 34% growth that was attributed to net interest margins, balance sheet growth, and strong trading revenue. Just take me through what the role of Standard Bank in that region is as you see it.
Oh, thank you. Firstly, I think Sim touched on the financial capacity that we provide, both on a foreign currency perspective as well as local currency, coming up with a lot of innovative solutions for the sovereigns in terms of how they manage their balance sheets. We act more like a super regional. The difference between us and, for example, an Equity Bank or a KCB, who would only work in the East African region, we're able to at least lean on a lot of expertise across the group because we're in 20 other countries. So we've been able to provide some other unique perspectives in terms of how we help sovereigns in raising capital, technical know-how, bringing a lot of different sort of things that they haven't really, in many ways, thought about. In addition to refinancing the Eurobond for Kenya, we raised almost $1 billion for Uganda and Tanzania in the last 12 months as well. So that's the one bit. And I also want to thank Bill for raising this conference, because one of the reasons, one of the things that we're criticized a lot when we go to, when I take Sim around and we're meeting with the heads of state and some of the government officials, is that they're always trying to ask us how we connect the national agenda of these countries. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about being a bank. Many of them have gone through this wave of understanding that, yes, you do need foreign capital, you need the foreign expertise. But at the end of the day, the growth is going to come from this the business and commercial segment. So how do we trickle that capital down? And how do we also bring that ecosystem to play? So I think this kind of conversation is extremely important in us going back and saying, listen, we're not just here as a multinational to extract a nice ROE and send it back to South Africa. We're here to actually to contribute. So this gives us a lot of impetus to go back and say that we do a lot more than just provide capital and all of that. And then lastly, I guess the other thing we do is bring a lot of connectivity across. For example, the China-Africa corridor is something that we've owned given our relationship with ICBC. And as you know, China's percentage of trade with Africa has grown significantly. The fact that we were very well positioned has allowed us not only to help fund a lot of the infrastructure. Infrastructure is a big play in most of these countries. And the ability that China was also willing to do some of that financing put us in a very good position to open that up as well. Yeah, so in a nutshell, I think that's what we do. We're more than a bank. We're a multinational that's there, that's trying to provide technical expertise to grow and sort of migrate as well away from just large multinational corporates and start to help and support the bottom of the pyramid as we grow, etc.
So Mufachuk is talking about just doing more than being an institution that's extracting and leaving, and then speaking on trade. The African Union says that trade between African countries is between 15 and 18%, which is low compared to other blocs. What strategies is Standard Bank implementing to support and facilitate increased trade among African nations, and why is that important?
So it's really important. Maybe starting with a thought that Adrian has raised, which is we were there when they were celebrating their 300th store, and we want to be there when they celebrate their 650th. We want to be there when ShopRite is moving its goods between South Africa and Zambia, or Zambia and Tanzania, and we want to be there to facilitate the reduction in the cost of the movement of those goods. Trade between intra-Africa trade, yes, you're right, is currently at roughly 14.9%. It's roughly 15%, and it should be significantly higher. Trade between the EU and the African continent is declining, but trade between EU and Asia is increasing. And we want to be part of both those developments. And perhaps let me mention two things that we are doing that are practical in direct answer to your question. The first one is AfriExim, in partnership with the Secretariat of the AfCFTA, have formulated what is called the Pan-African Payment System, which has signed up 60 banks throughout the continent, and we're one of those banks. The basic idea is to try and facilitate the movement of these goods in a way that is cheaper, so that people are not paying, let us say, in dollars through a system in the United States, but rather paying in local currency directly in a simpler way at a cheaper cost. That's essentially what that system is calculated to do. And it will be assisting yourselves as well as these great companies to move their goods and make it much cheaper. So that's one. The second one is we have the privilege of being owned 20% by the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, which is the largest bank in the world. We are the largest bank on the African continent, and we are partnering with them to facilitate the movement of people, goods, ideas, and capital between the African continent and China, and then accelerating the movement of those goods, people, ideas, and capital amongst Africans themselves. And perhaps later we could give you even more concrete examples of precisely with the nature of those transactions. So perhaps let me stop at those two examples.
Okay. Adrian, if Sim is talking about the innovations that are there to try and foster inter-Africa trade and grow them, how do you look at things like payment, things like artificial intelligence that Puti was referring to earlier on, to grow a traditional business, which is essentially buying fast-moving consumer goods?
The interesting thing is it differs from country to country, and you can
Okay.
see how the regulations and the rules and the payment options and costs changes the behavior. So if you take the Hungry Lion business, for instance, in South Africa, we mostly cash, but the card payments are growing quickly. It's 30% of payments, 70% cash. In Angola, where they had lots of access to cash problems many years ago, they switched to digital transactions quickly. And remember, this is small basket size of these takeaway food. Probably 60-70% of payments are digital. And then you get to a country like Zambia, where we're less than 10%. And the reason for that is simple. Something like debit cards and credit cards are exactly the same rate. Now, the bankers would know that a credit card should be higher than a debit card. A debit card should actually just be a cost per transaction, a flat rate. There's no credit risk. It's check the bank, is there money, yes or no, and transfer the money. But the structure within Zambia is such that we pay roughly 1.6, 1.7% in card transactions, debit and credit card transactions. So if the debit card transaction can just drop to South Africa, which is arguably also quite high, 0.6, 0.7%, you can get that low single-digit transactions up to probably Angola's levels over time. So although there's blockchain and Bitcoin and different payment mechanisms and structures, etc., it's getting the basics right. And I think, like Gulam said previously, growth solves a lot of problems. Speed also solves a lot of problems. In actual fact, the one quote that I've got in my office, like I said yesterday, I don't have a lot of slogans and quotes in my office and on the walls, but the one thing that's on my whiteboard in the corner is it says action at the speed of thought. So in our office is when you think of something, it should already start happening. And I think if we can start implementing a lot of these ideas quicker in Africa, speed will solve a lot of problems. Yes, you'll make mistakes, but it's easier to fix some of those mistakes after the fact than reminiscent about it for 2-3 years and nothing happened. So it's not a long answer, but I think the upside in payments, etc., and the financial sector within Africa is tremendous, because all we have to do is remove the own goals. We don't have to think of new plans. It's just put proper structure in place, proper guidelines for business, because people want to use digital payments, but we're almost prohibited to do it.
Puti, Adrian's speaking about innovation. Essentially, when there's ideas, move them quickly. That's a big part of what you do. Innovation and technology. Can you just take us through how you use those in your portfolio of companies, and what impact you foresee these innovations having on the broader African business landscape, bearing in mind what you also said earlier on about sometimes the difficulty of navigating the different spaces?
Yeah, I think it really is, it is difficult, but I think being African, we know difficulty, and that starts us in a position where we're able to think innovatively. So I would say that for us, one of the things that's important is the fact that we think globally, but we act locally. And so one of the first things, and I've mentioned this before, is the fact that we partner with founders of businesses. And so that helps us to be able to engage at a local level and ensure that we understand the dynamics that are really relevant within that market. And from that perspective, I mean, when I look at, for instance, our Swiggy business in India, which operates in around 500 cities in India, it's important that you are able to engage in a relevant manner. And through the use of AI, we really are able to get a lot of the benefits from that. And I would say that beyond that, beyond the food delivery businesses that we have around 70 countries around the world, we also ensure that we are significantly also focused on issues that are important, such as regulatory matters. Regulatory matters are affecting all of us globally. And so by partnering with local partners who understand the regulatory issues, you can ensure that you continue to evolve. I mean, right now here in South Africa, there's a number of regulatory matters that are affecting the digital sector. And for big organizations such as ours, who have the capability and access to resources to be able to deal with this, it's one thing. But for the many startups and early stage businesses that we have here on the African continent, this can almost stop and impede entrepreneurs from being able to continue towards success. And so it's important that we are able to engage with regulators in a meaningful way in ensuring that they understand the dynamics within our different markets, but also that we can also ensure that we are living up to dealing with the issues that regulators want to ensure, ensuring that we have a competitive marketplace, that we have products that are meaningful to our consumers, but that it's an environment where entrepreneurs can thrive. And so, these are two components that I think have been helpful for us. It's really being able to engage on a global scale, but also thinking locally, but also ensuring that we are very, very focused on the regulatory matters which are significantly affecting our markets.
Patrick, perhaps you can give us insight into what you believe are the key regulatory issues and hurdles facing businesses trying to expand on the African continent.
Well, first of all, I think there's always a myriad of regulatory bodies that have a mandate which they guard very closely whenever you get into any country. And I think my 3 pieces of advice would be: one is engage often, engage early. Statements like, that works differently for us in Mauritius are usually not helpful in Tanzania. They have their own views. So it's engaging early, making sure that you understand. Always try to find that there is a win-win situation. And I think many times when I've gotten involved in this, hiding in plain hindsight has always been a solution where both sides win. I mean, I'll just give you one example, which I think is one of the most complicated things that I've been involved in, where I'm sure you've heard of the East African crude oil pipeline, which is transporting oil from Uganda to Tanga, 1,500 kilometers, heated oil pipeline. 80% of the oil pipeline is actually in Tanzania. So you can imagine a situation where you've got 2 petroleum authorities, 2 ministries of energy, 2 parliaments, 2 marine authorities, 2 port authorities, 2 presidents, all of them trying to effectively repeal acts, reverse a lot of laws so that they could allow for this to happen. And we all got into a room, and in 18 months, we were able to solve a lot of those issues, remove tariff laws that had existed in the 1960s, allowed for, and it was a win-win situation because at the end of the day, Tanzania was going to get a $14 tariff, oil per barrel. To transport oil across about 1,200 kilometers across its country. Uganda was going to get its oil out as well, so that was also a win situation. So when the sovereign and the heads of states also got involved and said, just let us know whatever roadblocks that you have, and we will unblock them. I don't think I've seen anything more complex get completed so quickly. So there's a will, and there's always a solution. The problem is, I think, is getting in there and always assuming that you have the answer, which you don't always have. And also assuming that the local resources on the ground who have that mandate do not know exactly what's good for them. So we often, in the background, try to help our clients to understand where the landmines are and explain to them that this is a very complex situation, And please avoid that. Please avoid saying that. And this is the sequencing in which we will do. And if there are roadblocks, we will get you to the right people. So I don't think that any of these sovereigns really have any roadblocks in place to avoid multinationals. The one big concern they will have, I will say, is that a lot of them felt like they gave up too much and they're no local champions anymore. So they're trying to reverse some of that and saying, we built a lot of multinationals. Uganda is a very special case. The top 5 taxpayers in Uganda are South African. SAB Miller, MTN, Standard Bank of South Africa, ABSA, and then I think at some point ESCOM was also paying taxes. But that's a big point. 5 out of 10 taxpayers were South African. So when you have that sort of a discussion with the head of state, he's saying, well, at the end of the day, when it's dividend time, I feel like there's an extraction of capital out of my country. I have no local champions. So we have to also be sensitive to the fact that they're trying to develop that expertise as well. They appreciate what we brought. They appreciate the capital and the technical expertise. But to show that and demonstrate that we're also trying to develop local champions is just as key. And so that's sort of kind of how we've sort of been trying to help our clients, and it's been working so far. Okay. And that also sits with not just the multinationals, even the business and commercial clients as well. Whether you're an MTN or a slightly smaller enterprise, they want to make sure that there's sustainability and the fact that you're not just coming there for an ROE. So trying to divert it from a financial return into something more sustainable.
So the theme of this conference has been unlocking Africa's growth. When it comes to fostering economic development and growth, can you give us examples of how Standard Bank has successfully partnered with international entities to drive development, and also maybe take us through what future partnerships may look like?
Oh, of course. One of the big themes, of course, on the continent is digitization. We have got some really interesting partnerships, and my favorite one is with Salesforce. And many of our clients here today will have felt the impact of our relationship with Salesforce, because our relationship managers use it to analyze data, to analyze client activity, and they use it then to improve the client experience. So Salesforce is really our client engagement platform, and it's an amazing set of tools, one of which is a program called Trailhead. It's basically a free training module. It's democratized. Adrian, I'm sure you'd agree, and it's a fantastic tool. It teaches you to code, it teaches you how to improve your customer relationships. And so it's a partnership we've got with Salesforce on the continent. So that's the first one. The second one is with General Electric. So in 2022, we signed a deal with them in terms of which we would help them sell health equipment in Angola, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. And there's already been drawdown on those facilities, and people have had access to radiography and other pieces of equipment that are sold by GE. The third example is the World Bank's Private Sector Innovation Lab, which was led by AJ Banga. AJ used to be the chief executive of MasterCard. He moved across to the World Bank, and one of his efforts is to try and crowd in as much funding into infrastructure for Africa from private sector, from the DFIs, and from governments, because we need that funding for our projects. And try and find ways of blending this finance, making it easier for financial institutions and banks to provide the senior debt, some people providing the mezzanine and the equity, and then indeed some people providing the grant funding or the philanthropic funding, trying to find this solution. We've provided ideas to that process, and one of the outcomes of that has been the harmonization of the World Bank's guarantee program, using some of these ideas. The fourth example is a partnership between ourselves, the United States, DFC, MEGA partners, and it's an arrangement we've done for an organization called Acorn Holdings, which is a Kenyan institution providing housing for university students in an environmentally friendly way, using this funding that I'm referring to, bank debt, debt from the DFI, and the private sector. And what's there not to like about that transaction? It's a public-private partnership, it's green, and it's providing soft infrastructure education and hard infrastructure housing for kids going to school. Those would be 4 examples which speak then to these public-private partnerships, the movement of money, capital goods, and ideas on the African continent, partnering with the United States, China, and the African continent itself.
Puti, what role is NASPERS playing in facilitating and accelerating digital transformation across the continent? I know we just heard about digitization a moment ago from Sim. And when we say digital transformation, what do we actually mean?
Well, I mean, digital transformation it's the way that we all have to go. I think as Sim eloquently put it, it really is, that is the way in which business and everyone is growing. And so we are doing that through ensuring here on the African continent that we're providing digital skilling. We have an entity here in South Africa called NASPERS Labs, where we are providing access to skills to young people. And in a country where we have so many people who are unemployed, it is important that they are able to get access to these digital skills, and particularly given the fact that South Africa is a net importer of digital skills. It's important that we're able to provide these skills. But beyond that, for our entrepreneurs, for them to be able to scale their businesses, it's important that they are able to get access to digital skills as well. So today, when we look at South Africa, we have, big international players like Temu, Shein, Amazon, who are here in the country. And it's important that our emerging entrepreneurs can be able to also be able, through the use of digital skilling and support in AI, to be able to grow their businesses and scale beyond South Africa even. And so, this is something that is critical, and so we are ensuring that we're providing that support here in South Africa. We are providing that support to the entrepreneurs that we work with here in South Africa, and we want to do more of that. I think what we found in South Africa is that a lot of the businesses on the early stage side are very much kind of at the startup phase, and you need to provide that additional support. I mean, Sim spoke to the various forms of financing that are available, whether it's grant financing or different forms of financing for entrepreneurs. But beyond that, you also need to be able to provide them with that entrepreneurship support so that they can scale their businesses. And so for us, it is something that is significantly crucial to grow businesses. Yeah.
Patrick, could you...
I can't resist doing this, sorry.
Please do
And I'm
it.
sorry.
It's your conference.
So Puti spoke about digitization. Now, one of Adrian's defining features is that he's a tech-savvy accountant. And he would agree with me that the trade barometer, the Standard Bank trade barometer, is really, really amazing. Because what it does, and I'd invite people, if you've got your gadgets with you, type in Standard Bank trade barometer, and you will see that it's a barometer that we use to gather information on trade throughout the continent in 10 countries. It provides you with the knowledge that you need to be able to move your goods throughout the continent, and the information is free, provided to you by Standard Bank using tech. So the point that you're making in support of some of the things that Adrian used to do at ShopRite, for example. Just thought I would jump in there with that advertorial.
No, thank you, because it's important to also talk about the context that we're operating in and where you can get information about what we're discussing. Push, you raised a very important point about young people, which we haven't spoken about, Patrick. The World Bank says, the United Nations rather, says that by 2050, Africa will account for 25% of the world's population. We know that we've got a massive group of young people, perhaps, who may not have the skills and access to what Putti was talking about. So how do shifting demographic trends, particularly urbanization, and those young people shape consumer behavior and demand across sectors? How do we need to look at that?
Perhaps we should start with the big elephant in the room, which is 3 weeks ago. I don't know if you've been following. There was a very organized, socially media-driven Gen Z attempt, basically, to remove the government in Kenya, and you know, they were very, should I say, very forceful about accountability for their leadership. There had been a finance bill that had been agreed that was going to be passed by the parliament that was going to effectively try to increase revenue because Kenya's debt to GDP has doubled over the last 10 years. And in order to sort of bring some sustainability and really narrow the fiscal deficit, they had agreed that they were going to increase revenue by taxing. The Gen Zs were not having any of that. So they basically came back in a big way, to the point that last night, the entire cabinet in Kenya was dissolved. We've not seen that sort of shift. Now, what are the big points there? The points were that, yeah, a lot of the money was spent on good things. And if you come to Nairobi, we've got a wonderful expressway from the airport, which I think you love, Sim. Takes you to the office in 12 minutes. We've got a standard gauge railway. And so there was allocation of resources on infrastructure. But the fact that we were not creating, you know, almost 1 million jobs that we need to do for these young people created a swell of a movement. And effectively what they're saying is reallocate the budget. We know that you cannot formally create these kind of jobs, but can you take some of that money and really bring it in to stimulate some of the entrepreneurship that we know? Kenya is known as the Silicon Valley. We've got a lot of young, very, very talented people just looking for policy changes, looking for a little bit of capital and a catalyst to create jobs. So that's really at the essence of what's happening at the moment. I know it's disruptive initially, and I think many people will say that Kenya is going to go through a turbulent period. But I think the fact that in the mid to the long term, there's a massive silver lining here, which is the young population saying that directionally, we think the most important thing you can do for us is to just create an enabling environment, and we will do the rest. We're not asking for jobs to come and work in the government, or we're not all coming to work for multinationals. But just get out of our way, and if we're going to collect some revenue, please invest it in us, like you were saying. That is the future. So I think they've raised a very, very big question that needs to be answered by a lot of African countries, because the demographics are not very different across the entire sub-Saharan continent. So in many ways, I'm kind of proud that Kenya has led the charge. It's going to be a bit turbulent, but we need to answer that question.
Yeah.
So the accountability and the humility of the leaders to having removed that finance bill and really gone back and to revisit. So what we expect to happen is that there's going to be a balanced cabinet maybe in the next few weeks or so that will include, or should I say will reduce the average age of the cabinet to allow some of these new ideas to come through.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
It does, thank you. Adrian, also another demographic that's growing quite rapidly is the African middle class. The Africa Dialogue series says that by 2060, 42% of the total population of Africa, or 1.1 billion people, will be classified as middle class. What's the potential there for growth for businesses for you? I know it's not 2100, but just before then, what's the potential and what are challenges that come with that growing middle class?
Well, the one great thing is those people eat a lot of chicken. So I'm extremely happy about the population growth, and not only the population growth, but the population dividend of a young population within Africa. So the opportunity and the problem is the fact that we need jobs for all those people. So during the next, like I said, long-term vision to 2100, Africa will become the working population of the world. The rest of the continents are aging, which will create other opportunities and challenges. But most of the working age population of the world will live in Africa. I don't know the exact percentages, but we will over-index on working age versus population. So even though Africa will have, let's say, 40% of the population of Earth by 2100, we might have 50 or 55% of the working age population. But that creates a massive opportunity for businesses where working class people consume more, they travel more, they do more things, they go to shows, they are active. And we could potentially become the engine for the rest of the world, where China has been the economic engine and the manufacturing engine for the last 20 odd years. Their population is declining. So I think, and again, I'm not a statistician, but they're over 1 billion people, and I think they're going to end on about 750 million odd people by the end of the century. Now, Nigeria will climb to about 750 people. The rest of the world are very worried that there's going to be 750 million Nigerians. I'm very happy that there's 750 million Nigerians. So I think the growth potential that we've got in Africa with 4 billion people to claim a bigger piece of the economic pie is tremendous. Okay. The biggest challenge for all of us will be creating jobs. And that's why my single focus in my businesses is to create jobs. Now, on the one side, there's Hungry Lion. We sell chicken, but we buy chicken from local suppliers. We buy all produce locally. So in Zambia, for instance, we're up to 97% local procurement. And I think that's important. We've spoken a lot in the last 2 days about cross-border trade between African countries. But even just getting supply chains in a country, you don't have to solve the border issues, which is a major issue. But to solve border issues, you need regulations, you need discussions between governments, and they don't move at the speed of thought. Okay. So just by solving problems in a country can already create the stimulus and that secondary jobs and economic influence on the rest of the people. Okay. And I think that's the most important thing. If we can activate, rather than getting just big multinationals into Africa to come and extract our human capital, to actually get local African businesses to expand. And I think this business unit of Standard Bank is much more important than the enterprise. I know the enterprises give more money, yep. But in terms of creating jobs, it would be the small, medium enterprise businesses in Africa that must thrive. And right. What we need is consistency of policy so that people can take their own money, put it in their own businesses, and create those jobs. And I think that's the biggest challenge. Big multinationals, it's easy for them to pull capital from somewhere. But if you've got your own small or medium-sized business and you must put your own money in there or borrow money from friends or put your house on the line, that's tough. And we need to create an environment for that to happen, to create jobs.
Right, we have a few minutes left. I would like to please open the floor to rapid fire questions, which are going to get rapid fire answers from our panelists here. If you do have a question for anybody on the panel, please may I ask that you raise your hand. Let us know who you're from, who you are, and who your question's directed to.
Thank you. It's Chris Bosch. I'm in the electricity distribution business. And I just made a few comments while sitting here this morning, unlocking Africa's growth. And for us to unlock Africa's growth, we need to fix South Africa. And that's not being said by being big-headed. South Africa has a big impact on the rest of the world. And for us to do that, we need to start reoccupying the moral high ground, which is something that we have lost to date. So the question is going to come, Gulam has actually answered, when you speak softly, that's when you need to listen very hard. And he ended off this morning's chat by saying that economic growth is going to solve the problems. And the people that's going to solve those problems are the people in this room. I actually want to narrow it down a little bit more and go down to the titans sitting on the stage. Because you are actually the people that can influence and impact this growth a lot quicker. And for us to drive this growth, we need to all have common ground in business and in South Africa. And what is that common ground? And in 1955, the Freedom Charter was published. And the sad news is that's what we have been fighting in. Yes.
My apologies for cutting you short. We are enjoying your insights, but I'd just like to make sure that we end on time when we give other people on the panel, in the audience, an opportunity to address the panel. Can I ask you to ask your question? Yes.
The question, therefore, is we need a common ground, and the titans on the stage has to chase the politicians, because politicians don't lead, they push. And they will only listen if the titans actually talk.
Yeah.
And somebody like Mr. Chabalala, you are our hope as far as that's concerned. That's the gravity.
Okay. I don't know that.
I think, the recipe is 1, execute Operation Vulindlela, 2, stick to rebuilding the great institutions in South Africa, 3, accelerate the AfCFTA so that we get the benefit of the reduction of tariffs and non-tariff barriers so that goods, people, ideas, and capital can move throughout the continent. 4, strengthen the state so that they can execute against those policies. And 5, get out of the way of business and civil society to do what they need to do.
Thank you. Just checking if there are any other questions from the floor directed at anybody on the panel. If there are, please may you raise your hand. A roving mic will come to you and let us know who it's directed to.
Good morning. I'm Andries from the agricultural sector. I'm just interested in the panel's view relating to the commercial importance of our BRICS relationship compared to the NATO threat against security, particularly against Russia and China. And what's our role in Africa at the moment, especially from the comments coming from Washington at the moment? Thanks.
Okay, what's the question? His question is about the role that BRICS plays compared to NATO. I'm not sure who would like to take that.
Well, I think, when you look at the numbers now and you see that the BRICS nations are actually significantly growing faster than the rest of the world, it shows the importance that these nations are playing in our global sphere. And so I think for us as African countries, the issue for us is to ensure that we continue to partner with everyone across the globe. I don't think that we want to be focused on just one particular grouping, whether it's the broader BRICS or NATO or any. I think what's important is that we are able to operate and engage with all parties. you know, as a country or as a continent that is continuing to emerge and to grow, we need all of these partners to work with us. And so from my perspective, I don't think that we're in a position to really be choosing sides. We're not in that position. It's more about being able to use every opportunity for us to be able to, you know, to achieve the growth that we need to achieve.
All right.
If I can add one on, I mean, the choice about whether you're going to China or the US has always been an unfair one, or the BRICS or etc. But one interesting development that I've seen recently has been the Middle East. You know, basically just coming into Africa and investing without really being solicited, investing whether it's in land, in ports, etc. And I think they have seen something. And obviously, you know, we can go into a history lesson around the connectivity between trade and the Middle East that goes back hundreds of years. But it's been interesting to see how much capital has started to flow from, you know, the Middle East back into the continent, which I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago, nobody would have seen. And it's creating a counterbalance now because it's providing, I think, the African countries with more options and narrowing us into this choice. Are you with the West or the East? Are you with Russia, etc.? Which has always been, I think, unfair. So it's good to have options, I guess, is the point I was trying to make.
Okay, checking for further questions from the audience. Please may you raise your hand, and then a mic will come to you.
It's Aditya Ram again. Do we see a time, and if so, when the regulatory environments, even regionally, will unify so as to ease cross-border expansion and improve efficiency in managing regulatory environments?
Do you have a specific person that you'd like to answer that?
I think I can ask the gentleman from Kenya because he was talking about the regulatory environment, but anybody who has a view on it. Thanks.
So the question was more about change,
Regulatory environments. Like we operate in 5 countries with 5 regulators, with 5 rules. Every country has to be managed separately. Do we see a time that even in SADC that we will see SADC protocols actually being unified and normalized?
Yeah. I mean, East Africa is a good example in the sense that and I think it all goes back to leadership, right? So what we've seen in the East African way is that the heads of state have led and said, these are the themes that we want to work on, infrastructure, etc. They set the agenda. The central banks have started to harmonize roles in terms of monetary policy, inflation targeting, etc. I know that there was some skepticism in the room the other day about having a common currency. But East Africa is actually working towards coming to a common currency. They have a plan that in the next 5 or so years, there'll be 1 shilling across East Africa. And they're working towards that. So I think it's all about leadership and the agenda being set. But again, East Africa is very unique in the fact that we're so connected. 40% of us trade amongst each other. So that has forced us to sort of think the same way. I can't speak intelligently about the other blocks, but I think the lesson is that if you start to think in a similar fashion and you have leadership that is aligned, it then kind of trickles down and sort of forces the regulation to sort of harmonize. And that's what we've seen, at least in the East African context.
I guess, you know, if I can add on to that, the reality is that we live on a continent with countries that have regulatory systems and which are consistently changing and growing. And the reality is that I personally don't see that unification in our lifetimes. You know, it's about seeing these countries actually being able to regulate in a meaningful manner, where we can start to see governments starting to engage with entrepreneurs and leaders of businesses before actually putting these regulations in place. Because if it's about growth, let it be about growth. Engage with us in a way that's meaningful for consumers, for regulators, to ensure also that we can have a position where we have our countries being able to grow their GDPs a lot more swiftly. And so the important thing is really, despite the harmonization, I would say, in each country, Let's have more engagement between regulators and entrepreneurs and business people so that we can have meaningful regulation for all of our countries.
All right, we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask for one word from each of our panelists, starting with you, Patrick, that's going to assist us when we're thinking about unlocking Africa's growth. Just one word.
Oof. I would say...
Just a word.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, I would say resilience.
Thank you. Adrian.
Optimistic.
Puti.
Collaboration.
Sim.
Trade.
Thank you so much. A big thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much to our panelists for your insight. I feel like we've learned a lot. Thank you to our audience for your questions, your attention, your engagement. It's been such a pleasure moderating this discussion. Bongani, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Gosh, that was a riveting session, was it not? Yesterday, Gulam mentioned the emergence of the big men on the political stage. And one of the things that I think that has been common amongst those politicians around the world, particularly those that are swinging to the right, is this idea of making a particular country great again. And Adrian, you mentioned one of my favorite authors, and that book, Factfulness, right, about the world not being as bad as you think it is, and perhaps not getting better fast enough. But as a newsman, I think a session like this is an opportunity for me to recalibrate and to look at what actually is happening in the world, the change that we've seen in Kenya, for example, Gen Z putting that government on notice. We spoke earlier, Gulam, about the changes in South Africa. And I think, once again, a gathering like this, I think for me, it's just that injection of actually things are moving. Maybe they're not moving as fast as we would like, but they're moving, and they're certainly moving in the right direction. And I think we'll leave it there as a wrap of the morning's session. We'll take a quick networking break, and we'll continue with our program. So just please, as you are mingling outside, be on alert for the notices to get back into the room. And also, someone has lost a phone, and just check your bags, check yourselves. If you're missing a phone, it's available at the front desk. We'll take a break.